Hello and welcome back to the online learning session. Students, this is quick revision series and today we are into history chapter 1, the French Revolution. So let us quickly see the topics which are going to be covered in this lesson. Number 1, Unit 1, French society during the late 18th century. Number 2, old regime. Number 3, plight of the third state. Number 4, the struggle to survive. Number 5, how a subsistence crisis happens. Number 6, a growing middle class envisages an end to privileges. Number 7, Unit 2, where we see the outbreak of the revolution. And number 8, France becomes a constitutional monarchy. Students, we know that in 1774, Louis XVI of the Bourbon family of kings ascended the throne. He was 20 years old at that point of time and he married an Austrian princess named Marie Antoinette. Under him, under Louis XVI, France helped 13 colonies of America to gain independence. Now this point shows that Louis XVI was quite spendthrift in nature and he used to spend a lot of money on his luxuries. Now we see that the state treasury, due to him being a spendthrift, the state treasury usually used to be under pressure, which resulted in the increase of taxes. Okay. Then we come to see the old regime. What do we mean by the term old regime? Students, the term old regime is used to describe the society. 2 points to be picked out from here. Number 1, society and institutions in France before 1789. So what do we here actually mean by society? We mean the different levels in which the society of France was divided in the late 18th century, that is before 1789 particularly, and the institutions, particularly when here we talk about institutions, we are talking about the political institutions, the type of government which existed in that country at that point of time. So as we know, the society here is clearly divided into 3 different stages. So basically clergy and nobility were 2 states who were very powerful in the French society. They were very closer to the king. That's why they yielded a lot of power in the French society. Now we come to the last state, that is the third state, where we see big businessmen, peasants, farmers, small peasants, landless labor and servants. Especially when we talk about the third state, we are especially concerned about the peasants, the workers, the laborers, okay, the people who are helpless in the society. Now when we come to learning about the institutions, we basically mean the political institutions in that country. Okay, so here who was the one who had the power in the country at that point of time? Of course, Louis XVI. So we here see institutions such as monarchy. Okay, so this was all about the French society in the late 18th century, the society being divided into 3 different levels according to the financial conditions as well as the power they had in the French society, plus what kind of institutions existed at that point of time. So we come to learn about the monarchy. Here we can quickly go through 3 pictures, and we can have a fair idea about the 3 different states. Okay. Now with students, we quickly get into learning the plight, the miseries of the third state. Okay, the bad conditions, the miserable conditions faced by the third state. Students, clearly we can see that 90% of the population of France was made by the peasants, yet 60% of the land was owned by nobles. It means that despite being 90% in the population, 60% of the land was owned by the nobles, the church and other richer members of the third state. It simply means that the peasants actually did not have a fair amount of share, okay, when it came to the land or any other property in that country. Next we see that the clergy and nobility were also exempted. They enjoyed exemption from paying taxes. It basically means that they did not have to pay any kind of taxes. They were left out from the category of paying taxes, plus they also enjoyed certain other privileges as well. So we can again derive from this point that these 2 states were the most powerful besides the king in the French society. Okay, now we come down to learning about peasants who were obliged that they had to render their services to the Lord, and in turn Lord wherever sent these peasants had to go and render their services, whether they had to own house, on fields or in army, and even to participate in building the roads. So wherever their lords sent them, they had to go and render their services to the lord, who actually were the nobles and who actually served for the king. Clear? So we see that in between the nobility existed, in between the king and the third state. Next we see that tithes and tile, two kinds of taxes, were extracted from the peasants by the church. Okay, and we also see that the burden of financing activities of the state through taxes was borne by the third state alone. So this was the plight of the third state and peasants in particular. We come to see how people of the third state were being exploited, okay, and how the upper two classes, the upper two states of clergy and nobility, yielded power in that society. Next we come to learning about the subsistence crisis. Students, let's first of all define the term subsistence crisis. As in the previous lecture we had already gone through this topic and we had broken down into two parts, that is, one is subsistence, that is survival, and crisis, which means the lack, okay, acute shortage or chronic shortage. So we see an extreme situation where the basic means of livelihood are endangered. Clear? So what was the situation, what was the condition in France developing at that point of time which led to subsistence crisis? It's quite natural that we see between 1715 and 1789 the population growth was 23 million to 28 million. So there was a clear-cut growth of 5 million population in France. Now students, it's but natural that with the increase in the population, the demand for food grains will also go up. Okay, so the demand also increased rapidly for the food grains, but we see that production couldn't keep pace with the demand. For example, the production of the food grains was not in proportional to the demand for food grains by the increased population. That is why we see what happened. So we see that the price of the staple diet rose rapidly. Okay, so there was a price rise in the staple diet, but we also see that the wages did not keep pace with the rise in prices. So the wages on one side were not increasing. On the other hand, when we see on the other side, the prices of the staple diet rose rapidly. Now it's going to create a situation of complete anarchy and complete chaos and a complete disturbance. That is why we see people to be being disturbed at that point of time very much. And what was there to worsen the situation? We see the weather conditions of drought and hail worsened the situation by destroying the harvest and ultimately leading to the subsistence crisis. So the points which we need to arrange in a systematic manner for understanding the subsistence crisis of any region, here particularly we are concerned about France. So we see that there is a population growth of 5 million. It's but natural that with the population growth, the demand for the food grains will also go up. But what happened in France at that point of time? The production of the food grains could not keep pace with the demand for food grains. As a result, plus in the society, what happened? The prices of the staple diet rose rapidly, but on the other hand, the wages did not keep pace with the rise in prices. So what happens? People feel disturbed and they feel troubled in this kind of a situation. Moreover, drought and hail worsened the situation by destroying the total harvest. That ultimately led to shortage, acute shortage, chronic shortage of crops, food grains, and this situation ultimately led to subsistence crisis in France. Now we move ahead and we see that there is a growing middle class and emergence of middle class in the 18th century France. And we see that this middle class advocates 2 points. Okay, 2 strong points are put forward by this middle class. Now you will tell me in the comment section and in the answer section you will post that what did this middle class comprise. Okay, basically I intend to ask what kind of professionals, what kind of people were there in the middle class. Were they put in the middle class, were they categorized as a middle class by their level of income or by the type of occupation they were engaged in? So the first point which the middle class 18th century France advocates is that privileges to be based on merit and not on birth. A very concrete point first. of all to be put by the middle class, that privileges in the society must be based on merit and not on birth. For example, here they are directly talking about a person X, if he is born in clergy or nobility, should not get the privileges in the society just because he got born into C or N, that is clergy or nobility. Rather, X must prove his merit. X must prove that he deserves what privileges he should get, or what privileges he is getting at the point of time. So he should prove that point, that he deserves that treatment. Okay, and this should not be based on birth. It means, what it directly means, that they advocated for a society which was based on equality. Okay, so they were now breaking the barriers and they were getting into a society, they were trying to establish a society which was based on equality, which was based on merit and not on birth. Okay, students, now we get into learning about a few philosophers and thinkers of the French society. We are getting into an era of mass awakening, we are getting into an era of social awakening by philosophers and thinkers. So students, one such philosopher was John Locke. Okay, now we see that he directly refutes doctrine of divine and absolute monarchy. Now what do we mean by this? Students, you might have seen that there is a theory which goes on in the European society. You might have seen a king usually to be accompanied by a priest who hails from a church, basically. So there was a concept, there was a theory, there was a hypothesis going on in that European society, that the king has been sent on the earth by the god as a messenger, and that king has the powers, that king has been given all the powers by the god to rule the people. So this was the doctrine of divine, that God has sent. What do we actually mean by doctrine? Doctrine means any theory. Okay, so this was a theory which was somehow related to divine. These people were linking this theory to divine, that God has sent the king as the messenger, and God wants to rule the people through the king. That is why they established, on the doctrine of divine, they established absolute monarchy, that since God has sent me, God has sent the king, that is why I come here on the land, on the earth, and I establish absolute monarchy. Now we come down to learning about Rousseau, and we see that he advocates for a government based on social contract. Now there is a contract, there is an agreement between the people and their representatives. Okay, so he paves the way for what type of government should be there. He paves that a government should be there which should be based on a social contract between people and the representatives. Now when we come down to Montesquieu, we see that once the government is formed, so how it should rule the country. Okay, so it clearly meant that the powers must be separated and must be independent among the organs of the government. So Montesquieu gave to this world the form concepts of legislative, executive and judiciary. Now students will try to establish, will try to find out some links among all these philosophers. First of all, in a sequence, if we try to break all the concepts down, we see that John Locke first of all refutes the doctrine of divine. He completely refutes the doctrine of divine. So he says that there is nothing as such which is related to God sending kings as messengers and God wanting the people to be ruled by those kings. So he says that there should be no king, because no God has sent that. Then what kind of government should be there? He also refutes absolute monarchy. Okay, he completely goes against absolute monarchy. Now when we try to establish a link between the concepts of Rousseau and John Locke, we see now once he refutes that there should be no monarchy, then what kind of government should be there in a country? Of course, then we see Rousseau to be paving the way for that. He says there should be a government which should be based on a social contract between the people and their representatives. Somewhere he was democratic in his principle, in his theory. Now once this democratic government is established in a country, how should it function? The government, the different organs of the government must be divided, and the powers must be clearly demarcated, must be clearly given to all these three sections, all these three organs of the government. That is legislative, who is vested with the powers of making laws in the country; executive, who is vested with the powers of implementing those laws, getting the laws implemented, and judiciary, who is vested with the power of protecting the law from getting violated. Clear? Now students, when we come down to learning about the mass awakening, we also need to see what were the effects of mass awakening. What happened when all these philosophers were being read in the society? Their thoughts were being read, their books were being read in the society by the people. So we see that the ideas were being discussed intensively in the society among different classes and at public places as well. So we see that the ideas were being discussed intensively in salons and coffee houses. That it actually means that the ideas were being read and the ideas were being discussed in the society. Now we also see that these ideas were read aloud in groups for the benefit of those who could not read and write. Even for the people who could not read and write in that society, we see that a few people were there who used to read aloud in groups for the benefit of the people who were not able to read or write, but they should be able to discuss these ideas of getting awakened. Now we also see that Louis XVI was planning to impose further taxes. What was Louis XVI planning? Louis XVI was planning to impose further taxes, but we come down and we see that Louis XVI could not impose the taxes on his will alone. Rather, he had to call a political body, a meeting of the Estates General. Okay, so the point which needs to be picked out from here is that taxes, then we need to pick out Estates General. Now what was this Estates General? Estates General was a political body, okay, to which all the three states sent their representatives. As we have seen that it was there in order to impose a tax only when this proposal, when this resolution was passed by the Estates General in unanimity. Therefore we see, once the idea of this Estates General was put forward, we see that on May 5th 1789, that is yesterday, 200-300 years back in 1789, Louis XVI called together an assembly of the States General to pass proposals of new taxes. We all know that, clear? But what is important, what needs to be focused upon, is the very fact of the system of voting. Okay, so let us deep dive into the system of voting and learn and pick out points from there. So we see that the first and second states sent 300 representatives each, clear, and they also had one vote each as a state, clear, and 600 members of the third state were there who had to stand at the back. Okay, now we see that the States General had a system where each state had one vote. Now this time too Louis XVI was determined to continue the same practice, but members of the third state, here is the bone of contention. What members of the third state wanted? The members of the third state wanted that the voting now be conducted by assembly as a whole, where each member would have one vote. This is the very system of voting which the third state was trying to get implemented. Okay, now what happens, this was one of the democratic principles as well, which was put forward by philosophers like Rousseau in the book known as Social Contract. But what eventually happened, the king rejected this idea outrightly, and due to this the members of the third state walked out of the assembly in protest. Now what happens when they walk out of the assembly in protest? Yes, they take the tennis court oath. For that they need to go into the tennis court. So what happens, on 20th June they assembled in the hall of an indoor tennis court in the grounds of Versailles. There they declared themselves a national assembly. So the government, the name of the government formed by the representatives of the third state was named as National Assembly. Plus they swore not to disperse till they had drafted a constitution. What was going to be the important feature of this constitution? Yes, to limit the powers of the monarch. Clear? So 2 points to be picked out. First, 20th June they get into the hall of the indoor tennis court at the grounds of Versailles. There they declared themselves as National Assembly, plus they swore not to disperse until they had drafted a constitution. Now what was one of the important features of this constitution? The feature was that it should limit the powers of the monarch. Clear? And as we all know that they were led by Mirabeau and Abby CS, and Mirabeau was born in a noble family, whereas ABCS came from a clergy family. Now that's okay. Let us move ahead. Now we see that there was a lot of turmoil going on in France while the National Assembly was busy at Versailles drafting a constitution. The turmoil basically means the state of French society was quite disturbed. Okay, so the peace was actually disturbed. The people were not at peace, and therefore the rest of the France seethed with turmoil. Now what were the conditions at that point of time in the regions? A severe winter meant a bad harvest, prices of bread rose. We have already seen this in subsistence prices, and often bakers exploited the situation and hoarded supplies. That is, they did not sell the supplies at a fair price, and they projected that there is a shortage of supplies in order to increase the prices. So what happened? The people had to spend long hours in queues at bakeries, which made them angry. So angry women stormed into the shop, and what happened eventually due to this anger? We see that on 14 July the agitated crowd stormed and destroyed the Bastille. The Bastille was the fortress prison of France. Okay, now we come to learning about what happened next. We see that in the countryside, this was all about Paris. Now we see here, we also see the scenario of the countryside. Rumors are spread from village to village that the lords of the manor had hired bands of brigands, okay, who were on their way to destroy the ripe crops. Caught in a frenzy of fear. What happens when someone tries to attack your property? You tend to, prevent that attack, neutralize that attack. So what happens here? The people, the peasants at that point of time, were caught in a frenzy of fear because they had a fear of getting their crops destroyed by these bands of brigands. So what happens? They were caught in a frenzy, and peasants in several districts seized hoes and pitchforks and attacked chateaux. These were the huge mansions of the nobles, okay, and where they looted, hoarded grains, burnt out documents containing the records of manorial dues. It contained the records of the peasants who had to pay their dues to the nobles. Okay, so what happened as a result? The nobles fled from their homes, many of them migrating to neighboring countries as well. Next we see powers to be checked by the constitutions. Okay, so what do we learn here? We learn that after all this happened, Louis XVI finally accorded recognition to the National Assembly. Earlier, Louis XVI was not ready to accept National Assembly as the current government, but with the passing time, what happened? He was made to accord a recognition to the National Assembly and accepted the principle that his powers would from now on be checked by a constitution. Okay, now exactly what they had swore inside the hall of the tennis court at the grounds of Versailles, that they will draft a constitution which will limit the powers of the monarch. Now we see on the night of 4th August 1789, what happens? The assembly passes a decree. Decree means a law abolishing the feudal system of obligations and taxes. Now the feudal systems of rendering services in obligations and paying taxes were completely abolished. Now what happened? The members of clergy were forced to give up their privileges, these were abolished, and lands owned by the church were confiscated. Okay, and they also had to let the government seize their assets worth 2 billion livres. Livres was the currency of France at that point of time. Hence we see that France becomes a constitutional monarchy. Okay, now what do we mean by this term? Let us see. It simply means that a political system where we have a constitution, and the main objective of the constitution is to limit the powers of the monarch. Now this constitution was drafted in 1791. Now students, we see that this constitution of 1791 sought to divide the powers, okay, and divide the powers in different kinds of government organs like legislature, executive and judiciary, and this is how France was made into a constitutional monarchy completely. Okay, we see that the new system worked on the basis of division of the powers among the organs of the governments completely. Okay, And this is how we see. Let us go through a set of features of this constitution. We see that the citizens first of all voted for a group of electors, number one, who in turn chose the assembly. Now what were the features? All the citizens did not have the right to vote, so who had the right to vote? Let us go through that. Only men above 25 years. Criterion number one, only men above 25 years of age who paid taxes equal to at least 3 days of a laborer's wage were given the status of active citizens. Okay, so here we also get to see that this constitution divided the entire society of France into two different categories of active citizens and passive citizens. Clear? You can clearly see that the men above 25 years of age plus paying taxes equal to wages of 3 days of a laborer were accorded the status of active citizens, and they were entitled to vote. The remaining men and all women were classed as passive citizens. That is what we mean. We mean here they did not have the right to vote, they did not have the right to say anything in the government, and they were treated as passive citizens. Now we also see the criterion of the elector. To qualify as an elector, you have to be the highest in the highest bracket of taxpayers. So what do we pick out from here? We pick out a few more but important features of the Constitution of 1791. We see that this constitution clearly separates the entire citizens into two different categories, first being the active citizens and the second one being the passive citizens. Now who were the active citizens? The men of 25 years of age who had the right to vote were the active citizens, plus the people, all the remaining people who did not have the right to vote were considered as passive citizens. Second, we see that to qualify as an elector, a person needed to be in the highest bracket of taxpayers in that country at that point of time. So still one problem which is there, that despite being a government from the third state, this government was drafting the constitution and giving the rights to the people on the basis of their sound financial condition. Now this is not correct in a society which has, plus moreover for a society which has gone through a revolution. It was not a very good criterion to divide the powers and give the rights to the citizens. Now we see a few features of the constitution. The constitution began with a declaration of rights of man and citizen. A certain natural rights and inseparable rights were given to the people by the constitution of 1791. The rights such as right to life, freedom of speech, freedom of opinion, equality before law. And what do we actually take out from here? That these rights were established as natural and inalienable rights. What do we mean by natural and what do we mean by inalienable? By natural we mean that all these rights were given to the citizens from birth, number one, and number two, inalienable means inseparable, something which is not strange to you, okay, which cannot be made strange for you. Clear? So the rights, these rights could not be taken from you. So basically this is what we mean by inalienable. So therefore we see natural and inalienable rights being given to the citizens, okay, and it was also the duty of the state to protect each citizen's natural rights.